Hello, welcome to the Learning Playlist, a podcast for the major and general education courses under the tutelage of Mr. Ryan Dave Ryla, USJR College Instructor. This project is a supplement to the said courses and as a means to share knowledge to the public at large. To help the podcast grow, kindly follow us at facebook.com/the learning playlist. And now, on to our show. Hello and welcome to today's lecture on the contemporary world, Paradigms for Understanding the Interstate System. I am Ryan Dave Ryla, USJR College Instructor for the Department of Social Sciences and Philosophy. This lecture is about the three main paradigms of understanding the framework for the interstate system, or three main frameworks for the interstate system: Realism, Liberalism, and Constructivism. For today's lecture, here is the presentation roadmap. We are first going to talk about the assumptions of realism, followed by liberalism and cooperation, and constructivism. As we go along, we will understand why these three main paradigms are in order. Alright, first let us talk about realism. Now, the paradigm, the framework of realism is based on the idea that there is anarchy in world politics, that there is anarchy in the billiards table, as we have noted earlier. And since this anarchy exists on the interstate system, this is the context, or this is the general setting that we find ourselves in. And anarchy means the absence of a world government, and that states can pursue their goals even if it is detrimental to others. And this is because there is no greater authority than states. The second assumption of realism is also based on the first assumption, and that is that states are the basic units of the international order or of the interstate system. Basically, it means that states are sovereign, and since they are sovereign, they are all of equal standing diplomatically, and these states have control over their own domestic affairs and, of course, their foreign affairs. And since there is no bigger authority or no supreme authority than states, there is no checks, or there is no limit to how they conduct their affairs on the international stage. And because of this, states pursue their own interests, whether it be geopolitical, political, or otherwise. So this is how the world is according to realism, that states vie for control because they are sovereign, and that states are sovereign by virtue of their territorial integrity. And these geographical boundaries are perhaps the basis of sovereignty for the states, no? And this is also the base of their power. The ability to control a domain or a territory is critical for any state. And nation states, these are the countries that we know today, are defined by geographic boundaries. Okay. So are states sovereign? Yes. But what does sovereignty mean? Sovereignty means this is the supreme and independent political authority, especially on the domestic side of things. So domestically, a state domestically should have no contender for power. It should exercise an all-encompassing authority when it comes to its own territorial boundaries. However, on the international level, sovereignty is, perhaps we can say that sovereignty is only limited by the power or the sovereignty of other states as well. So in this sense, we can see that according to Bova, no supreme sovereign authority exercises all-encompassing political authority, and this goes back to the first premise of this discussion, which is anarchy exists. So, because of this anarchy, states are considered as rational unitary actors. This means that rational, they are they are they are conscious of their goals and they make the best choices to pursue their goals, primarily the goal of security. And by pursuing security, states also pursue power because power grants security. We will discuss later on what power actually means. So, they are also unitary actors in the sense that they have core interests that are um, let's say crucial for the survival of the state, no? Whether it be the pursuit of influence over other countries or perhaps the pursuit of military technological dominance, then those are part of the core interests of a state. We can even say that national security is a byword for core interests. Okay, and national security cannot stand alone on its own. It needs what we know today as self-help. That means that states must be able to defend themselves against other states. It can be done in two ways. First, we states can conduct military build-up. For example, it can build its navies and armies, aka what the United States has been doing for the past 70 years, or it can conduct asymmetrical warfare, other means of conducting war like electronic warfare, and more recently cyber warfare, aka hacking. States can also help themselves. They can conduct, or rather, they can provide for their own means via allying with other states that are equally or perhaps even more powerful than they are. So, in this sense, alliances or the banding up with other states to combat a common threat has been a timeless example or a timeless tactic for states. You can see, for example, that in the past, during the time of the Greek city-states, there was the Delian League, and then later on, in the Second and the First World War, there are the Allied powers. Okay. So self-help can be summed up in these two pictures right here. On the top portion, you can see that the Allies actually portray themselves as fighting for freedom. Now, this is a poster from World War One. Then on the bottom half, on the bottom picture, you can see that Lancelot actually brought a missile to the round table of Camelot, in which he shows off that he is far more well armed than all the other knights of the round table. And so it starts what we now know today as an arms race. Okay. So in essence, realism actually views the world as in a constant state of warfare, that war is the norm, peace is not, and peace largely does not last long. And so in this example, in this picture that I'm showing to you, you can see that states actually they actually prepare for war constantly, and they concentrate their forces on their borders so that they can take advantage or they can defend themselves if in case another force tries to attack it or another country tries to attack it. No? This is an example of a classic game, a classic board game called Risk, and it's a perfect example of what realism is all about. Okay. Now, going to liberalism and cooperation, we shall see what's the difference between the worldview of liberalists and realists. Okay. So, can anarchy be regulated? Well, the answer to that, according to liberalists, is yes. Now, it gives rise to another question. Why regulate anarchy in the first place? Well, there are three sets of answers provided by liberalists. And the first one is political. Okay, to regulate anarchy means to limit warfare and its destructions. Okay, so war is destructive and war is disruptive as well. So to limit war and to remove its causes is in it alone a very noble political goal. Okay, so great power politics or the great wars of the First and the Second World War, and even prior to that, the 30 Years' War that devastated Europe during the 1600s, these are prime examples of what war can become if left unchecked. The second argument offered by liberalists as to why anarchy should be regulated is the fact that there is great potential in commerce and trade, and that the greater the economic cooperation of a country, or rather of states of different countries, the greater would everyone profit from it. No, so it's a win-win situation basically, and this is the norm of what has been happening in at least the past 70 years following 1945. But we must also note that commerce and trade is not always equal. It's not always fair. Okay. The third and final argument for why we need to regulate anarchy, according to liberalists, is that there are greater chances for human development. So there's a social dimension to regulating anarchy rather than states fighting one another and constantly worrying about their military and diplomatic and economic situation. States can focus more on developing their human potential by raising standards of living rather than raising arms or raising armies. Okay, so this is the modern concept of human security rather than thinking about traditional security, where the focus now transcends, or where the focus now is set on developing the standards of living for communities, for individuals, rather than simply worrying about the security of the state in terms of military and political security. Now, we can compare both paradigms or both frameworks in this way. For realism, anarchy is the norm. But for liberalism, while it acknowledges anarchy as a reality in our world, it it hopes that cooperation should be a goal worth pursuing for, or should be a priority for states rather than constantly worry about anarchy. And for realism, since there is anarchy, states, according to realists, are are primarily concerned with short-term or relative gains, wherein they gain, or a state benefits at the cost or at the expense of others. So basically, realism, according to its assumptions, well, the world is a zero-sum game, no, or the interstate system is a zero-sum game. Everyone else must lose if a state is to be victorious, no. So there can it's what can we say? How shall I say it? It's a winner take all system according to realists. For liberalists, however, there are absolute gains to be made, wherein while not everyone can be, let's say, can be satisfied with the gains, in some way or another, everyone gains something out of cooperation rather than simply the zero sum game of realism. So, for liberalism, cooperation is possible. States can move beyond power politics. States can transcend their insecurity against one another. So, with cooperation comes peace. And because there is absolute gains, we can benefit from it. Okay, we can benefit from it. And perhaps liberalists would argue that we are far better having cooperation as the norm rather than anarchy, simply because with while we acknowledge anarchy, cooperation makes life better for everyone else. Okay. So, as for the proponents of liberalism, liberalism has deep roots, deep philosophical and deep even, let's say, intellectual roots across different disciplines. We can even trace liberalism to as early as the 1700s with Immanuel Kant's ideas about perpetual peace that basically outlines that states need to create frameworks or institutions to establish peace. It doesn't have to be always war, but rather they can work through some mechanisms that they have come to agreed upon. Now later on, President Woodrow Wilson, who is also an academic, he is in fact a former president of the American Political Science Association. Woodrow Wilson, uh, he tried to he tried to achieve a different kind of politics outside of realism. Back in his day, realism was known as realpolitik, and realpolitik was the kind of diplomatic practice and let's say backstabbing per se that great powers that like the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, France, and others have participated in for centuries. But for Woodrow Wilson, he tried to, he was the president of the United States during the First World War. He tried to achieve certain ideals like collective security in the form of the very first international organization, which is the League of Nations. And because of this, his ideas became a precursor to what we now know today as the paradigm or the framework of liberalism. Now, Michael Doyle, who is a contemporary thinker or contemporary academician, has also identified three types of liberalism: institutionalism, internationalism, and commercialism. Okay. So as you can see that liberalism has its roots from the First World War, primarily from the thoughts and the ideas of Woodrow Wilson, followed by the interwar years of 1919 up until 1939, so basically a 20-year period. Then liberalism was actually largely discredited due to the outbreak of the Second World War, or rather its precursor, idealism, was largely discredited because the idea of collective security as embodied by the international organization, the League of Nations, failed to check the aggressions of countries like Japan and Germany and even Italy. So with the outbreak of the Second World War, liberalism was largely relegated to the dustbins of history, or so everyone thought. With the outbreak of the Second World War, realism was king up until the Cold War. However, liberalism has always been there as a counterbalance to the more, let's say, to the more pessimistic interpretation of the world by realists. And in this way, we can see here what Michael Doyle was talking about. Remember this fellow, Michael Doyle? He was talking about the different strands of liberalism, and we shall elucidate upon them right now. Liberal institutionalism is basically the creation of institutions to try to reduce the anarchy of the international system. It's establishing not only norms, but establishing organizations and, in general, international law that provides the mechanisms to prevent countries from simply going to war with one another over the slightest provocation. So the creation of international norms, international law, and many other protocols that states have to go through before they can at least no before they can or before they engage in hostilities against one another is actually a part of the paradigm or of the sub framework of liberal institutionalism. Institutions, or let's say mechanisms, can reduce anarchy in the international system. It gives it a sense of stability and order. Then there is liberal commercialism, in the idea that there is great potential for trade to mitigate warfare, that trade can become as productive or perhaps even more productive than the conduct of war. Then there is liberal internationalism, which states that democratic states rarely fight against one another, or so the assumption goes. So all of this idea of Michael Doyle is actually captured by other political scientists, in particular O'Neill, who mentions that the Kantian triangle, or the idea that there is interdependence between the said strands of liberalism, actually work. Now, they named this interdependence after Immanuel Kant, who actually proposed ideas that were the precursors of liberalism in the first place. Okay, so institutions are key to creating economic interdependence between states, and of course, economic interdependence means that democratic ideals will spread around the world, or so the assumption goes, no? Because as we know nowadays, even though um, even though there is greater economic interdependence than ever, we can see that not all of those who participate in the global economy are democratic states. We can see that the fastest growing, and we can even argue now that it's now the largest economy in the world, China, is non-democratic. Okay, so the Kantian triangle, as I mentioned, was first coined by political scientist John O'Neill um, and his collaborator Bruce Russett. Okay, so the assumption again was there was a synergy between those three factors as mentioned, or rather those three strands of liberalism. Okay, now let's go to the last part, which is constructivism. Okay, so what is constructivism? Well, it arose as a critique. It arose as a response to the inadequacies of realism and liberalism. So the emphasis of constructivism, in contrast to the heavy emphasis on power and cooperation by realism and liberalism, is on the idea of identity, or basically the power of culture. Okay, so in the 1990s, there was a resurgence of nationalism, and even that trend continues on today, 30 years later. We can see that very powerful groups have or very unique groups like the shell state that was ISIS, and even today with the return of the Taliban to Afghanistan after the US withdrawal, no, from that country, after the end of the US occupation of that country, we can see that identity or culture still plays a huge role in politics today, especially in international politics. So the pursuit of power is not everything, and cooperation is not entirely about cost benefit analysis. Why? Because states are not simply, let's say, they are not simply looking for the best ways to achieve their goals, but rather they are looking for symbolic gestures as well as a means to achieve their goals. And not only that, culture plays a large part in how they interpret the world. And culturally speaking, this is the missing link as to how the first two paradigms interpreted the world. Culture matters. And constructivism, coming from that background that culture matters, offers us an explanation of the world as we know it. Okay, or rather, it offers us an explanation of the world different from the other paradigms that came before it. Okay, so social reality is not simply something that is straightforward, but it is constructed. There are different meanings behind it. There are different perceptions, and not only how people view one another, but how states view one another also matter in the way they interact. Okay, states, for example, that have very close cultural proximity are far better in terms of relating with one another than states that have huge cultural differences. And institutions, like for example, international organizations, or even down on the domestic level of states, like schools, government offices, etc., they shape behavior of ordinary people and groups of people as well, and they eventually shape the behaviors, no, the political culture of a state. So images and culture are very important because this shapes the foreign policies of countries. And in world politics, and we have mentioned this earlier, values, norms, and identity matter. Okay? Ideas matter in the world of international relations. Okay. We can even see it clearly here in this example of McDonald's India. Um, it did it did somehow tickled my imagination, as you can say, as to why don't they have beef products in India when McDonald's is very well known around the world for its burgers, right? And of course, I think we all know the stories about India, or the well-known fact about Indian culture that many Hindus do not eat beef, and in fact they they adore, no, to say it lightly, they adore cows per se. So globalization as a process is not simply something that is localized or something that is coming from the outside imposing on localities, but it adapts as well. And because of this adaptation of globalization, it is best to interpret it according to the perspective of constructivists who put a heavy emphasis on culture and ideas as key towards understanding the international system. So important theories that you might want to search and read on their work for constructivism. We have Alexander Wendt, who famously stated that anarchy is what states make of it. Basically, that anarchy is subject to interpretation by different cultures, by different states. Then we also have Samuel Huntington, who is also a pillar of political science in many circles. He argued in his now famous and contentious book, The Clash of Civilizations, that in this era after the 1990s, no, it will be characterized by cultural clashes between cultural groups, and we can even argue that this is true to a sense. In a sense, we can look at debates about the Islamization of Europe, for example, as argued by nativist parties in European states, and of course, with the discomforts, or rather with the turbulence experienced by developed countries as they assimilate more and more people from third world countries who also bring their culture with them. Okay. Then there is Edward Said, perhaps the most influential of the three, in the sense that Edward Said actually built upon the idea that colonialism persists to this day in the way that culture, not only culture, but in the way that Asian peoples, and perhaps we can even argue Muslim peoples around the world, are continually represented as an other, as a negative image of Western civilization the world over. And this approach of Edward Said has actually yielded much fruit in the form of post-colonial studies. Okay, even though Edward Said is not actually a political scientist or an IR scholar, but a linguist and culture professor. So in this portion, we can see that these three thinkers are very critical, or very very vital for our understanding of constructivism as a framework. So we can look at anarchy in three flavors, or in three ways. We can look at it from the perspective of realism, that power matters and that states are always going to look for security via power. For liberalism, that anarchy can be mitigated by institutions and norms, and that there is the possibility of cooperation when those are set, no, when the conditions are set, when the right conditions are set. Then there is constructivism, that identity and norms matter in this world, not only the considerations of power, but how states actually interpret their interaction and the world around them. Okay, not only states, but people as well. Okay. So I will end this lecture on this note. This is coming from Joseph E. Stiglitz, another prominent professor who has written extensively about globalization in the past 2 decades. So for Stiglitz, um, we can even contextualize his thought for this last part of the lecture. We can contextualize it in the way that the frameworks actually inform us, uh, that actually the frameworks, or how the frameworks actually inform us on matters of importance, not only for foreign policy but for understanding the contemporary world. Decisions were often made because of ideology and politics, and as a result, many wrong-headed actions were taken, ones that did not solve the problem at hand, but that fit with the interests and beliefs of the people in power. And with that, I end this lecture. Thank you for listening, and I'll catch you on the next one.